The scope was already dirty when I took the watch, rain static crawling across the screen like something alive that refused to settle. The desert out here makes its own weather at night, and the monitors never show it the way your eyes do. July 23rd, 2012. Nevada Test and Training Range. New moon, clear sky. The kind of darkness that makes every light source look like a decision. We were 3 in the truck. I was Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole, Security Forces, 6 years in. Team lead on a perimeter patrol I could have driven with my eyes closed. Senior Airman Reed was up front with the optics, scanning beyond the fence line the way we were trained. Slow, methodical, never trusting the first glance. Airman First Class Daniel Hargrove rode in the back with the radio, logging transmissions and keeping the quiet company of the comm set. We rolled out of Checkpoint Alpha at 2147 hours and put in the kind of miles that turn a route into muscle memory. At 0203, we stopped for a marker check. Routine. I was bent over the logbook on my knee, pen moving under red light, filling squares that made the night official. Reed had his binoculars up, doing a sweep. Hargrove was listening to the radio hiss, waiting for the kind of traffic that rarely came this deep into a cold sector. Reed spoke without moving his head. Calm voice. Cole, northwest, 15 degrees above horizon, moving object. I looked up, and it took me a second to see what he meant. Against the starfield there was a shape. Dark, because it wasn't reflecting anything. Dark, because it was removing stars. Triangular, clean-edged, gliding south to north with no sound. The first thought you reach for is always the thought that keeps your world intact. Drone. Training platform. Something we're not read on. But drones have profiles. They carry their own physics. This didn't. Hargrove, check traffic, I said. Any scheduled flights in our sector? He cycled through the frequencies with the impatience of someone hoping to be told this is normal. Negative, Sergeant. Airspace is cold, no TAMs, no activity. I lifted the handset and called range control. Alpha Control, checkpoint 3. We have visual on unidentified aircraft. Northwest bearing, heading north. Request status. Static. Then a voice that didn't sound surprised, which was the first thing that bothered me. Stand by. Stand by meant they were either looking for it or deciding what they could admit to seeing. 30 seconds is a long time when you have eyes on something you can't name. The object kept steady, low enough that it should have given us noise, high enough that it shouldn't have been there without clearance. It moved like it wasn't fighting air. Check. The controller started, stopped, then came back. Checkpoint 3. We show no traffic in your sector. Confirm visual. Confirmed, I said. Large triangular aircraft, 3 visible lights, estimated altitude 2,000 feet AGL. There was another pause, longer, then. Maintain observation. Do not approach. Log coordinates and heading. Stand by for further instructions. Do not approach. Log it. The words were procedural, but they weren't the words you use when you think someone is violating restricted airspace. You scramble. You challenge. You identify. You don't tell a security team to watch and write, as if you already know the story, and you're just collecting the right version. I took the night vision binos and found the underside. 3rd gen, military grade, the kind of optic that makes faint starlight look like daylight. The craft was an equilateral triangle, sharp corners, hard geometry. It wasn't black paint. It looked like it absorbed the image. The surface was smooth in a way I'd never seen on any airframe. No panel lines, no rivets, no maintenance seams. Just a flat, black presence. 3 corner lights sat recessed and flush, pale amber, steady. No blink, no FAA pattern. The center light was larger, white with a faint blue undertone, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat that didn't belong to anything living. When it brightened, it threw a brief wash across the underside, and still the surface showed nothing you could grip with your eye. Seamless. "Hargrove," I said. "Dash cam rolling?" "Recording since Reed called it," he answered. "Clear video. Good. Evidence. Something that would keep this from becoming a story that dies in the throat." I updated range control, detailed what we were seeing, and waited for the expected escalation. Instead, I got the same tone. Maintain observation. Do not approach under any circumstances. That's when I understood the part no one teaches you. Sometimes the perimeter isn't there to keep people out. Sometimes it's there to keep people like us from wandering too close to what's already inside. The craft continued eastward, steady, silent. It moved at a speed that looked like 40 knots, something slow enough to feel deliberate. At our elevation, about 4,200 feet, this was low. Low enough that any conventional platform should have given us rotor wash, turbine whine, something. The desert holds sound. It does not give it back. There was nothing. I wrote down the time. I wrote down the bearing. I wrote down the first description in my log. Because habit is the only thing that survives when your brain tries to reject what your eyes are sending it. And then the object did something that turned observation into consequence. I stayed on the optics and tried to keep my breathing steady. Reed was still, the kind of still you get when training takes over. Hargrove's radio crackled once, then went quiet again. The craft held its line, then changed speed in a way that didn't look like acceleration. No spool up, no gradual increase. One moment I was tracking it smoothly. The next moment it was farther along its path, as if the space between frames had been cut out. Not a blur, not a streak, just a jump in position that my eyes couldn't account for. "Jesus," Hargrove said, and the fear leaked through. It covered what should have been miles in under a minute. Then it stopped, not slowed, stopped. From high-speed transit to dead hover, instant. Any conventional platform would have had to bleed speed. Inertia is not optional. This acted like it was. I checked the GPS. The craft was now east over terrain we weren't supposed to treat casually. I read the bearing aloud to anchor myself. 087 degrees. I wrote coordinates the way you write them when you know you might be questioned later. 37 242, north 115.7893, west. The craft began to rotate. Not banking like an airframe. The whole triangle spun on a vertical axis, slow and deliberate. Full circle. Then it halted, facing south, toward us. It felt like being noticed. The center light intensified until the desert around it looked faintly lit. Even through night vision, it was uncomfortable, like arc welding. The pulse changed. 3 beats. Bright, brighter, brightest. Then back to the earlier rhythm. I lowered the binos and blinked away the ghost image. "What's it doing?" Reed asked. "I don't know," I said, and hated the honesty. The craft dropped. Straight down, fast, controlled. It vanished behind a ridgeline in seconds. No impact flash, no dust plume. Nothing that suggested a crash. Either landing or going below our line of sight by design. I keyed the radio. Range control, checkpoint 3. Object descended behind ridgeline. Possible landing. Request guidance. The voice that came back wasn't the same controller. It was older, command level. Checkpoint 3. Return to base immediately. Do not investigate. Acknowledge. Sir, we have a potential landing site, I said because procedure demanded it. Negative, the voice cut in. RTB now. Direct order. That tone wasn't anger, it was containment. Roger, I said, returning to base. We turned the truck south. Hargrove had gone quiet, not because he had nothing to say, but because he was doing the same math I was. What does talking cost? 2 miles later, headlights came toward us fast. 2 matte black vehicles, unmarked, heavy. They stopped in the road like they owned it. 4 men got out, not Air Force uniforms, no recognizable unit patch. Their gear was clean and identical, the kind of uniformity you see in people who live in compartments. A captain approached our driver's side, early 30s, no name tape, no patch, only rank. Staff Sergeant Cole, he said, not a question. Yes, sir. I need your observation logs, all documentation from tonight's patrol. Sir, I need to see authorization, I said, because reflex is hard to kill. He raised a tablet. The screen showed a directive with code words I'd only ever seen in briefings. Classification above anything in our shop. Authority level well above my chain of command. This is your authorization, he said. I didn't have time to read it properly. That was the point. I saw enough to understand I would lose if I challenged it. I handed over the logbook. I handed over the dash cam memory card. I watched his men bag them like evidence. Your report will be filed by my personnel, the captain said. You and your team will sign it on return to base. What about the aircraft? I asked. His eyes didn't change. There was no aircraft. The way he said it wasn't denial. It was instruction. You observed a possible atmospheric phenomenon, he continued. Unusual light patterns common in this area. Nothing more. Staff Sergeant, he said, leaning in slightly. You observed atmospheric phenomenon. That's what your report will state. Is that clear? It was clear. Yes, sir, I said. He turned his head. Airman First Class Hargrove. You're being reassigned. Effective immediately. Hargrove stared, confused, then scared. Sir, I'm currently assigned. Not anymore, the captain said. Gather your equipment. You're coming with us. Hargrove looked at me in the rearview mirror like a question he already knew the answer to. I didn't have one. Then they opened the back door and took him. They moved like they'd rehearsed it. No shouting, no visible urgency, just practiced control. Hargrove didn't resist. Maybe shock, maybe instinct. Maybe he understood resistance would only change the paperwork that followed. One of the men took his radio harness off him with the care of someone removing a tool, not disarming a person. Sergeant, Hargrove said once, low, like he didn't want them to hear. It wasn't a plea. It was the sound of someone trying to make the moment real, to anchor himself to the last person who might still say his name tomorrow. I held Reed's gaze for half a second. The rulebook in my head flipped pages it had never had to use. Interfere, and you become the problem. Comply, and you live with it. Follow instructions, I said, because it was the only sentence that didn't get us all taken. They guided him into their vehicle, closed the door, and the 2 trucks pulled out, heading north, back toward where the craft had dropped. Their taillights disappeared into the desert like they'd never been there. Reed and I sat in our cab, headlights fixed on road. We could smell the dust their tires had kicked up. They were waiting, Reed said finally. Yeah, I answered. They were ready. Ready meant this had happened before. Ready meant there was a protocol. And the protocol didn't include witnesses keeping their own records. We drove back in silence. The road south felt longer than it ever had, as if distance had become punishment. Reed kept his eyes forward. I kept glancing at the mirror out of habit, then remembering there was no one in the back seat to watch. We hit the gate before dawn. The duty officer met us like he'd been waiting, because he had. He didn't ask what we'd seen. He didn't ask why we were early. He handed me an after-action report already printed, already filled, as if the night had been decided somewhere else while we were still parked under the stars. I read it under fluorescent light that made everything look cheap and tired. Possible atmospheric anomaly observed. No action required. That was the whole event reduced to a line that couldn't raise questions. "Sir," I said, keeping my voice flat, "this report is inaccurate." He didn't flinch. He leaned forward, lowered his voice, and said the sentence that makes the military feel less like a service and more like a machine. "That is the report, Sergeant. Sign it." "Regulation requires accuracy," I said, because some part of me still believed rules meant protection. He watched me for a long moment, then spoke slowly, like he was giving a warning to someone standing too close to a ledge. "Listen carefully. You can sign and continue your career, or you can refuse and be processed out. General discharge, medical reasons, psychiatric evaluation, unfit for duty. Your choice. Make it now." I understood in a clean, clinical way. It wasn't about truth. It was about control. A signature was not agreement. It was consent to be managed. I signed. Reed was brought in separately and given the same paper. He signed too. No one mentioned Hargrove. No one acknowledged that a member of our team had been taken off the road by personnel outside our chain of command. The absence of his name in the paperwork was its own kind of evidence. 3 days later, I was transferred. No explanation beyond operational needs. New base, new unit, new geography, as far from Nevada as they could send me while keeping me CONUS. Reed was moved a week after. Different direction, different command. The effect was obvious. Isolate the witnesses. Sever the shared context. Kill the possibility of comparison. I tried to call him anyway, once, through a personal phone. It rang and rang, then went to voicemail with a generic greeting that didn't sound like him. When I texted, the message delivered but never showed Reed. At my new unit, I did my job and kept my mouth shut. That part came easy. Silence is a muscle you develop in security forces. But the night stayed in the back of my skull like a grit you can't rinse out. Every time a briefing referenced range safety or restricted operations, I heard the captain's voice. There was no aircraft. I told myself Hargrove had been reassigned to some special program and would come back with a story he couldn't tell. I told myself paperwork existed somewhere, even if I couldn't see it. I told myself the system doesn't lose people, but the system had already shown me how easy it was to make a record clean. 6 months later, an unknown number called. Blocked ID. I almost let it go, then answered because some part of me wanted the night to resolve into something explainable. "Staff Sergeant Cole," a male voice said. "Middle-aged, professional, not a telemarketer, not a prank." "Who is this?" I asked. "Someone who knows what you saw," he said. "Someone who saw it too." I hung up. My hands were cold on the phone. It rang again. I let it go to voicemail. The message was short. July 23rd, 12. Triangular craft. Silent. You're not alone. You're not crazy. But stay quiet. For your own safety. I deleted it. Then I stared at the screen, realizing deletion doesn't undo the fact that someone had my number, my name, my event, and that meant I wasn't the only one being watched. After that call, I stopped thinking of the incident as a single night. It was an ecosystem. There were roles, observers, handlers, cleaners, and we had been sorted into our places the moment Reed first said, "moving object." Range control's pauses made more sense now. The calm instructions. Do not approach. Log it. Those weren't improvisations. They were a script. I began to understand why the dashcam mattered to them. Because it created a rival record inside the system. Two versions can't coexist for long. One of them has to be erased. And the one that survives is always the one with the higher classification. I still kept a notebook. Not official, nothing with coordinates or call signs, just impressions and questions written in plain language, the way you write when you're trying to preserve what you felt before someone edits it out of you. I didn't consider it evidence. I considered it insurance, a way of proving to myself later that I hadn't dreamt it. At work, I kept my face neutral. I did patrols, checked gates, handled routine incidents. But I watched people rotate through the unit like tides. Specialists arrived and left faster than they should. Comms techs, radar-trained airmen, intel analysts attached for support. They'd show up, spend 8 or 10 months, then disappear to another base with no ceremony. I'd been in long enough to know turnover happens. This wasn't normal turnover. This was managed. The military teaches you to accept reassignment as life. That's how you keep forces flexible. But this felt different. It felt like someone was preventing any one shot from accumulating memory. I didn't say that out loud. I wrote it down instead, once, in the notebook I never brought on base. A single line. They disperse the witnesses. I didn't know yet how literal that line would become. Once you start looking for a pattern, you stop seeing isolated events. You see management. I waited weeks before contacting Reed again. Not through government systems. Not through anything that touched base infrastructure. I used a commercial app with end-to-end encryption, the kind we were warned not to trust, and the kind that still felt safer than official channels. I kept it brief. I told him about the blocked call, the voicemail, and the way people were rotating through my new unit like no one was meant to settle. He replied hours later, short. Same here. He wrote that his shop had a turnover rate that didn't match mission needs. Comms people reassigned to supply. Radar operators moved to admin. If you wanted to prevent a group from talking, you didn't have to threaten them. You just had to keep them from being together long enough to compare notes. "It's information management," Reed wrote. "Counterintelligence without saying the word." I didn't want to believe it because believing it meant acknowledging that what happened to Hargrove wasn't an aberration. It was an option in a menu. Take the evidence, rewrite the report, scatter the witnesses. If necessary, remove one completely. I started watching the movement boards like a gambler watches a table. I didn't have access to anything classified beyond my role, but you don't need classified access to see when a unit is bleeding people. I wrote down dates. I wrote down AFSCs. I wrote down names in a private code, so if anyone ever opened the notebook, it would look like my own calendar scribbles. In 6 months, I logged 37 personnel movements in a unit of about 200. Almost 20% turnover in half a year. On paper, you can explain it as staffing, as deployments, as training. In practice, it meant no one learned the rhythms of the place long enough to ask why certain hangars had different rules, why certain radios carried different traffic, why certain patrol routes were optional depending on who was on duty. I brought it up once, carefully, to a senior NCO I trusted. I framed it as concern about cohesion. He looked at me like I'd stepped too close to a wire. "Don't study it," he said quietly. "Do your job. Let rotations be rotations." That was the first time someone in my new chain gave me the same advice the voicemail had. Stay quiet. Reed and I tried briefly to find others. Not by naming what we saw. Not by saying triangle or craft. We used the kind of language veterans use when they're testing the water without exposing themselves. Anyone ever see something on night patrol that got handled above your level? Anyone ever get told to rewrite a report with no explanation? Questions that could mean anything. And that was the point. We found a few people who answered the way you answer when you're afraid of being the first to say it. A radar operator who described tracking a target with no transponder and no heat signature, moving in ways that made his supervisor take the headset off and walk away. 2 weeks later, reassigned out of his specialty, a maintenance tech who said he'd been called in at night to work on an airframe he wasn't allowed to look at until he was already inside a hangar. He said he'd signed paperwork before and after, and then got transferred within a month to a job that had nothing to do with aircraft. They made me irrelevant, he wrote. So what I saw couldn't become expertise. Another security troop who hinted at a wrong kind of debrief after a perimeter incident, then deleted his account entirely 2 days later. That deletion felt like its own message. None of it was proof. That was the system's elegance. It didn't have to deny everything. Just had to keep everything below the threshold of corroboration. I kept looking for Hargrove anyway. That became the obsession underneath all my other work. I told myself I wasn't trying to expose a program. I was trying to find a teammate. That felt morally cleaner. It also felt safer, even though it wasn't. I filed a personnel inquiry through official channels. Simple request, reaching out to a former team member. The response came back in sterile language. The individual cannot be located in our personnel database. Verify spelling. Verify service number. I verified, sent it again. Same answer. I called the personnel office directly. A clerk said, "Let me check." And I heard keyboard clicks. Then silence. Too long. "Sir," she said finally, "I'm transferring you to my supervisor." The supervisor came on with a voice that sounded like caution wrapped in professionalism. "Sergeant Cole, I see you've been trying to locate Airman Hargrove." "Yes, ma'am, I need his current duty station." "That information isn't available." "Not available," I repeated, "or not accessible?" A pause. Both. Her next sentence was the one that turned my search into a risk. "I'm going to advise you to stop making inquiries about this individual. Is that understood?" I said yes, because saying no would have been a performance, and performances get noticed. When I hung up, I stared at my notebook and realized the system hadn't lost Hargrove. It had removed him, and it had just warned me that even asking where he went was a way of joining him. Word count, 905. Part 5. After that warning, I tried to make my search look like something else. Paperwork. Process. The kind of bureaucracy that lets you pretend you're not doing anything dangerous. I filed a FOIA request. I told myself it was legal, that legality was protection. I requested assignment history and current status for a former teammate I couldn't locate. The denial came back with its own kind of precision, exempt from disclosure under Exemption 1, classified national security information. Personnel records don't get that response unless someone has been placed under a compartment that eats the entire file. Even then, there's usually a cover trail, an official duty station that's false but exists. Hargrove had nothing, a blank that still had weight. I tried a different route. Public records, family. It took an hour of searching to find his parents in Ohio. I called his mother and introduced myself as someone who'd served with her son. I expected anger or relief. What I got was exhaustion. "We haven't seen Danny in 3 years," she said. "They say he's receiving treatment." "Who is they?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "The Air Force," she said. "They call every few months." They say he's making progress. They say he'll be released soon. But it never happens. "Do they tell you where he is?" I asked. "No," she said. "No visits, no address, nothing. Just phone calls." I heard in her voice the way grief changes when you can't complete it. If someone is dead, you mourn. If someone is missing you, freeze. Indefinite is its own kind of cruelty. "Have you hired a lawyer?" I asked. "We tried," she said. "The lawyer said there's nothing we can do. Danny signed forms, consent forms, treatment authorization, everything legal, voluntary. That word again. The same word that makes a cage look like a choice." I ended the call politely and sat in my car with the engine off, staring at my hands. Hargrove hadn't just been reassigned. He'd been converted into paperwork that protected everyone above him. I started asking around through unofficial channels. Quiet calls to people who worked personnel systems. People who owed me favors. The answer was always the same. "That file is flagged. If I look at it, I get questioned." One person, an old friend from security forces, told me more than he should have. We met off base. No phones on the table, the way you meet when you're pretending you're not paranoid. "Stop looking," he said. "You're going to end up on a list." "There's a list?" I asked. He didn't smile. "There's always a list." "Where is he?" I asked. "What facility?" "I don't know," he said. "Nobody tells the truth about where they send people like that. But there are places. Medical holds, psychiatric evaluations, off-book facilities that exist on paper only for the people with the right codes." "For what?" I asked. "For seeing something?" He exhaled through his nose like he was tired of living in the same country as my innocence. "For knowing something they can't risk becoming contagious." Contagious. Knowledge as infection. It fit too well. I tried one more official inquiry a month later and got an even colder response. Further requests regarding this individual may be construed as interference with protected medical operations. Protected. Another legal shield. I told myself to stop. I didn't. I hired a private investigator. Civilian. No military history. I paid in cash and gave him only what he needed. Name, service number, last known date. I told him I wasn't looking for classified details. I just wanted confirmation that Hargrove was alive and a way for his family to contact him. 3 weeks later, the investigator called and sounded like a man who had been introduced to the edge of something. "I'm returning your retainer," he said. "Why?" I asked. "Because I was visited," he said, "by people who didn't need to show credentials." "Who were they?" I asked. "The kind who know where my kids go to school," he said. "The kind I don't argue with. Neither should you." He hung up. My money arrived in the mail 2 days later, untouched. That was the moment I accepted that Hargrove was not simply difficult to find. He was guarded, and the guard wasn't a fence. It was a system that could reach into civilian life without leaving fingerprints. I backed off publicly after that. No more FOIA. No more calls to personnel officers. No more investigators. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood the message. The same message that had been delivered in a captain's flat voice on a desert road. You can keep your life, or you can keep pushing. I chose to keep my life. The guilt of that choice didn't feel like relief. It felt like a debt that would never stop accruing interest. So I did what people like me do when we can't act. I documented. Quietly, carefully. Encrypted files on external drives. Paper notes hidden in places no one would search unless they already knew to search. I told myself it was insurance. It was also defiance. And defiance, even silent, has a way of being noticed. Reed agreed when I told him what the investigator said. "They don't have to threaten you," he messaged. "They just show you they can touch your life anywhere. That's enough." After that, small things started to feel different. A car that sat too long at the end of my street. A click on the line when I talked to my sister. Probably nothing. Probably my own nerves. But the point of pressure isn't to leave proof. It's to make you police yourself. I was doing exactly what they wanted. I just refused to let the night become nothing. In 2015, I deployed for 6 months. Nothing special about the orders. Standard rotation, different theatre, the kind of mission that fills your days with routine so you don't think about what you left behind. 2 weeks into the deployment, my phone buzzed with an alert from my storage unit company. Access recorded. At first, I assumed it was a clerical error. Then a second alert came. Then silence. I couldn't do anything from overseas except call and ask someone to check. When I got home, the lock was intact. No pry marks, no bent metal. Whoever opened it did it like it belonged to them. Inside, my expensive stuff was untouched. TV, camera gear, laptop case, even the cheap tools that a normal thief would grab. What was missing were the things no one should have known mattered. My notebooks, the external drives, the printed copies of my own logs and summaries, anything that contained the night or the search afterward. The police report called it selective burglary. The officer shrugged the way officers shrug when they can't name the motive. Identity theft, maybe, he said. Someone looking for documents, but they didn't take my bank statements. They didn't take my mail. They took only the record. The timing was too clean. I'd been gone exactly 2 weeks. Someone knew I was deployed. Someone knew I wouldn't walk in on them. Someone knew where to look and what to leave so it would feel like an accident. I called Reed on an encrypted line. He didn't let me finish. "Same thing happened to me," he said. His voice sounded tight, controlled anger under discipline. 3 weeks ago, while I was TDY, took only my notes, left everything else. "Then it's not a burglary," I said. "It's a reminder," he answered, "and a clean-up." That was the first time I felt a true shift in my fear. Before, the pressure had been indirect. Warnings, denials, veiled advice. This was contact, a hand inside my life. They hadn't just told me to stop. They had proven they could enforce it. I went through my apartment that night like I was back on patrol, checking windows, scanning corners, listening for sounds that didn't belong. I found nothing. That was worse than finding something. Nothing meant they didn't care if I knew they'd been there. Nothing meant the message had already landed. I destroyed what little I still had. Not out of obedience, but out of self-preservation. I wiped old phones. I burned a few pages that had names on them. I kept one thing, the memory, because you can't burn that without burning yourself. Reed and I stopped communicating after that. No more encrypted messages. No more checking in. We understood the same rule without saying it. 2 witnesses talking to each other is a liability. 2 witnesses silent are manageable. I tried to focus on the rest of my life, on promotions, on daily work, on the way time moves when you let it. I got good at acting like the night never happened. Most of the time, I almost believed my own performance. But guilt doesn't fade when you stop looking at it. It waits. It sits in the back of your mind with a name attached to it. Hargrove. I couldn't stop thinking about the moment he looked at me through the rearview mirror, and I gave him a sentence that sounded like leadership and felt like betrayal. Follow instructions. Years passed and the system did what systems do. It absorbed the event and moved forward as if nothing had happened. No one contacted me again. No one threatened me. The absence of pressure started to feel like a trap closing in slow motion. If they were quiet, it was because I was behaving. I retired in 2019. Honourable discharge. Full benefits. I moved to a small town in Montana where the nights are truly dark and the nearest base is far enough away that its weather doesn't reach you. I told myself distance was safety. For a while it worked. I stopped checking the sky. I stopped flinching when a car slowed near my house. I started to believe I could outlive the incident the way you outlive an injury, by learning to move around it. Then in the fall of my first year out, a padded envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a single printout of a document I recognized immediately. It was our after-action report. The sanitized one. No cover letter, no explanation. Just a copy I should not have had. And on the bottom margin, in pen, someone had written 3 words that weren't a threat. They kept him. I stared at that line until the paper felt heavier than it should have. Because someone out there knew where Hargrove was, and they wanted me to know that they knew. The copy had been cleaned the way official documents are cleaned. Blocks where names should have been, dates rounded, language smooth. But there were marks you only notice when you've signed the original. The corner where a staple had been removed. A faint impression from a redacted stamp that had once been darker. A strip of clear tape across the top edge like it had been pulled from a file folder in a hurry. It wasn't proof to anyone else. It was proof to me that my file still existed in someone's cabinet, and that cabinet could still open. I didn't show the page to anyone. I put it back in the envelope, sealed it, and hid it the way you hide something you're afraid to throw away. Part of me wanted to believe it was a mistake. Part of me knew mistakes don't arrive without return addresses. That night I sat at my kitchen table in Montana and listened to the house settle. The desert had followed me, and I understood a final rule. Silence isn't an end state, it's maintenance. I didn't record anything right away. I lived with the envelope for months, like a piece of shrapnel you can't remove without making the wound worse. Some mornings I would take it out, stare at the sanitized language, then put it back before the paper could change my day. What pushed me over wasn't courage. It was fatigue. I got tired of carrying a night that had been edited into nothing. Tired of watching my own memory blur at the edges, the way all memories do when you don't speak them aloud. I realized that if I waited long enough, the incident would disappear, not because anyone erased it, but because time did. So I started building an account the only way I knew how. Like a report. Dates. Times. Observations. Minimal adjectives. No conclusions I couldn't support. I didn't do it to convince anyone. I did it so that if someone ever found the files after I was gone, the event would still have a shape. On July 23, 2012, at approximately 3 hours, I observed a large triangular aircraft operating in restricted airspace over the Nevada test and training range. The craft appeared equilateral, flat black, non-reflective. 3 corner lights, amber, steady. 1 center light, white-blue, pulsing at roughly a 2-second cycle. No navigation blink pattern, no audible propulsion. It demonstrated flight characteristics inconsistent with conventional aircraft. Level transit without banking. Sudden change in velocity without visible acceleration profile. Rapid deceleration to hover without gradual bleed-off. Controlled descent behind terrain into a restricted sector. Those are the facts as I experienced them. The rest is what happened after I reported it. Shortly after observation, unmarked vehicles intercepted our patrol. Personnel presenting classified authority, confiscated logs and video. They instructed us to characterize the event as an atmospheric phenomenon. Airman First Class Daniel Hargrove was removed from our team and reassigned on the spot. He has not been located through normal personnel channels since. His family reports he is under long-term treatment without visitation or disclosure of location. Senior Airman Reed and I were required to sign a sanitized report under threat of career destruction and medical discharge. We were transferred soon after, separated, and effectively prevented from maintaining a shared record. That is the sequence. Every time I write it down, it still sounds unreal. And that matters. It is important to acknowledge how easily the human mind turns unfamiliar observation into mythology. I'm aware of that risk. I refuse to dress the incident in language that makes it entertainment. I have heard the term TR3B in the years since. I cannot verify it. It may be a real designation. It may be a decoy label meant to catch people who repeat it. It may be nonsense. Either way, attaching a name doesn't change what I saw. I have read, quietly, about proposed propulsion concepts, electrogravitics, field effects, inertial manipulation, ideas that live in the space between physics and engineering. Most are speculative in public literature. Some are bunk. Some are mathematically possible, but practically unreachable without power generation and materials we don't openly admit exist. It is conceivable, in theory, that a platform could be engineered to minimize acoustic signature and to maneuver without conventional control surfaces if it was using a different method of generating lift and thrust. It is also conceivable that the maneuvers I observed were misperceived under night conditions, that distance and scale distorted my estimates. That is why I kept the dashcam in my head, like a missing limb. Because the camera would have anchored perception to something external. But the camera is gone. All I have is a testimony and the fact that the system reacted the way it reacts to something it already understands. That reaction is what keeps the incident from being dismissed as a simple misunderstanding. If range control truly had no idea what we saw, standard protocol would have activated identification and interception. Instead, we were told to observe, not approach, and then we were met on the road by a team already equipped with a script and a directive. That is not how you respond to a random weather anomaly. It is how you respond to a known event that must not become a record outside its compartment. The more I wrote, the more the moral shape of the night clarified. The craft itself was the mystery, but the handling of the witnesses was the consequence. Even if what we saw was a domestic black program, even if it was human engineering and nothing more, the way the program protected itself did damage to people who had done nothing except look up. Hargrove's absence is the weight I can't lift. In the envelope copy of the report, the pen note said, "They kept him." That sentence can't be verified either. It could be cruelty. It could be a test. It could be a warning to keep me quiet by reminding me that someone still has custody. But it did what it was meant to do. It made Hargrove immediate again. Not an old teammate from a past life, but a present person in a present place I can't reach. And it forced me to decide whether my silence was still protecting anyone other than myself. I chose to speak in the only way that felt survivable, not to a reporter, not to Congress, to a recorder on my own table in my own house, where no one could interrupt me. When I press the button, I listen for the small mechanical click that confirms a file has begun. It sounded too much like a lock. Reed agreed to add his account with one condition. I wouldn't store his name in any file that could be searched easily. He was still active duty then, counting months to retirement, and he understood how quickly a pension becomes leverage when someone wants silence maintained. He wrote his observations the way he does everything, technical, stripped of drama. He said he was doing a horizon sweep when he caught movement against the stars. At first, he assumed satellite because the sky over Nevada carries plenty of them, slow, steady, indifferent. But the motion was wrong. Too low, too deliberate. Then, he said, the lights appeared all at once. Not blinking, not cycling on individually, but a simultaneous activation like a switch had been thrown. That detail mattered to him, because lighting is regulation, and regulations leaves patterns. This had none. He described a turn that wasn't a turn. The craft rotated as a rigid body, as if mounted on a pivot, without rolling or banking. He watched through binoculars and saw no control surface movement, no flap articulation. Then he watched the acceleration and called it compressed motion, the same phrase I'd reached for in my own head. He said it looked like time-lapse, like the craft covered distance without showing the intermediate positions. He said the deceleration was worse, because stopping should be loud, violent, visibly punished by physics. This was quiet, clean, indifferent. Reed tried for years to fit the observation into known frames. He wrote about inertial dampening as a concept, not as a claim, about field propulsion as a theoretical way to reduce the effect of inertia on a craft and its occupants. He wrote about power generation as the limiting factor, and about how black programs have historically moved ideas from theoretical to operational decades before public disclosure. He also wrote about the part that bothered him most, the response. He said range control's calm wasn't calm, it was containment. And he said the on-road interception proved there was a standing protocol for personnel who inadvertently witnessed certain operations. In other words, we weren't the first. After I read his addendum, I understood why Reed had gone quiet after the burglary. He hadn't just been scared for his career. He'd been scared because he'd recognized the system's basic logic. If we were predictable, we were safe. If we became unpredictable, we became a variable. Variables get corrected. My own fear had always been close to the surface, but Reed's was deeper, more disciplined. He didn't believe in villains. He believed in mechanisms. I asked him once, in a rare phone call, whether he thought Hargrove was still alive. There was a long pause before he answered. "I think he's alive," he said finally. "But I don't think he's free." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means they have ways," he said. "Medical authority, psychiatric holds, consent forms signed under pressure, legal frameworks that look clean from the outside. It's containment without the optics of detention." I thought about Hargrove's mother, saying he was receiving treatment, the way her voice had tightened on the phrase, like she didn't believe it either. I thought about the FOIA exemption, about the blank file, about how a person becomes easier to manage when you describe him as a patient instead of a witness. There's a quiet brutality in that kind of language. If you say medical, you can seal the door and call it care. If you say psychiatric, you can discredit anything the person says after. And if you say voluntary, you can erase the question of force entirely. The system doesn't have to kill you if it can classify you. I asked Reed if he'd ever tried to find the intercept team's unit. He laughed once without humor. "No name tape," he said. "No patch. That's the point. The unit is the compartment." He reminded me of something we'd both learned early in service. When you don't know who gave the order, you can't complain to anyone higher because you don't know who higher is. Chain of command becomes a circle. I realized then that my desire for a neat answer, what was the craft, who were the men, where is Hargrove, was a kind of weakness. The system thrives on it. It keeps you chasing the wrong kind of truth. The operational truth is simpler. There are events that trigger protocols. And there are protocols designed to outlast the people they touch. That's what we ran into on July 23rd. A protocol that treated us as an inconvenience to be managed and treated Hargrove as a problem to be removed. When Reed sent his final note months later, he ended it with a sentence that didn't read like analysis. It read like resignation. Even if it's ours, he wrote, the way they protect it is what should scare you. I read that line over and over because it reframed everything. The craft was the anomaly, but the real disturbance was how normal the suppression was. How easy. How practiced. It made me wonder how many other nights had been rewritten the same way, and how many other names had been filed into the same kind of blank space Hargrove fell into. That question followed me into sleep. Some nights I'd wake to the faint sound of wind against the house and think it was tires on gravel. I'd lie still and listen, waiting for a knock that never came. Waiting became his own kind of duty. People assume silence is passive. It isn't. Silence is work. You measure every conversation for risk. You screen every email. You choose your words so they can't be used to define you as unstable. You stop saying certain names out loud because saying them feels like lighting a flare. For years, that discipline was my life. I would see news stories about unidentified aerial phenomena and feel nothing but distance. The public version is always broad, always safe. It's designed to be debated without consequences. What happened to us was specific. It had a date, coordinates, a chain of responses. It had a person who vanished and a document that replaced him. In 2017, I watched hearings and disclosures change tone, and I told myself maybe the world was loosening. Maybe the system would eventually admit what we saw. Then I remembered how that captain spoke, and I understood. Admissions happen on the system's timeline, not the witnesses. The point is not truth. The point is control of timing. That's how it works. You don't have to silence everyone. You just have to make silence the rational choice. I thought about going to a congressman. Then I thought about the lack of evidence. The dashcam was gone. The logs were gone. The only thing I had left was my memory and Reed's addendum, and even that was a liability for him. I imagined being called unstable, imagine my service reinterpreted as trauma, imagine my story filed into a mental health drawer where it would do no harm. The system has more tools than a witness does, so I stopped chasing big moves and returned to small ones. Watching, noticing, the way certain veterans forums would light up with a familiar style of post, carefully worded, heavy on procedure, light on claims. People asking if anyone else had been pressured to rewrite a report, if anyone else had been transferred after a night incident, if anyone else had lost documents to a burglary that ignored valuables. I saved those posts as screenshots and then deleted them from my phone. I learned to keep evidence in a way that could vanish quickly. Sometimes I'd get messages from strangers. I know what you mean. Happened to me. Don't talk. Most of them were too vague to trust. Some felt like fishing. Some felt like men trying to convince themselves they weren't alone. I never answered. That was another lesson. Engagement creates a trail. But each message confirmed the one thing that mattered. The protocol still existed. The envelope with the sanitized report stayed hidden until I noticed something on the paper that I'd missed at first. A faint indentation where a second page had once been clipped. That meant the report had attachments. It meant there were details that had been removed even from the version they allowed us to sign. If I could ever find that missing page, it might list the intercept unit, or the directive number, or the medical authority used to take Hargrove. It was a stupid thought, a hopeful one. Hope makes you careless. A week after I had that thought, I found my mailbox slightly ajar one morning. Nothing missing. Nothing disturbed. Probably a delivery error. Probably. But I closed it and felt the same cold understanding I'd felt in Nevada. They don't need to take anything. Sometimes they just need you to know they can. That afternoon, I took the envelope and moved it again. Deeper. I changed hiding places the way you change routes when you suspect you're being watched. Not because it guarantees safety, but because it lets you feel you're doing something. In the months that followed, I started writing the account in full. Not just the night and the intercept, but the denials, the FOIA exemption, the mother's voice, the investigator returning my money, the selective burglary, the system's quiet reach. I wrote it in the same restrained voice I used in reports, because emotion makes a story easy to dismiss. I also wrote down what I didn't know, what I could not prove. I left the craft unnamed. I refused to claim origins. I refused to turn the event into a theory. The truth is, I don't know what the platform was. I know what it did, and I know how it was handled. Those are different kinds of knowledge. I kept returning to Hargrove, not the incident, not the craft. Hargrove, because he was the human cost the system could never make me forget. In my head, I replayed the moment they took him, and I asked myself the same question every time. What would have happened if I'd refused? If I'd demanded paperwork? If I'd blocked the door? If I'd turned the radio on and called for our own command to respond? The answer is always the same. I would have been taken too. The report would still have been signed by someone else. Hargrove would still have disappeared, and my family would have received the same kind of phone calls his mother did. That's the cruelty of the mechanism. It makes resistance feel futile, and then it uses your compliance as proof that everything was voluntary. By the time I finished the draft, I understood the last thing silence does. It turns you into your own warden. You guard the secret for them, because the consequences for not guarding it are immediate and personal. I don't have a clean ending to offer. I don't have proof that would survive scrutiny. I have a record of an operation that reacted like it was protecting something it already owned. And I have a teammate whose name lives in a blank space that paperwork calls treatment. That blank space is what I'm leaving this account to fill. Not with certainty, with weight. This is the part people expect to turn into a conclusion. It won't. I can tell you that I'm safe in the simple sense. No one has knocked on my door. No one has threatened me directly. The absence of pressure should feel like freedom. It doesn't. It feels like a leash that doesn't tug because you're already walking the way you're supposed to. Reed retired quietly. He sent one final message on the day his paperwork cleared. "I'm out," I wrote. "Don't contact me again." Then he deleted the account we'd used. That, in its own way, was a confession. He was still afraid. Or he was still disciplined. In our line of work, those are often the same thing. Hargrove remains what he has been since that night. A missing name in an official system that insists he's not missing. Sometimes I imagine him in a room with no windows, under light that never changes. Sometimes I imagine him in a hospital wing, with doors that lock from the outside. Sometimes I imagine him on a base that doesn't exist on maps, under a medical classification that makes every complaint he could ever make sound like a symptom. I don't know which is worse, and I don't know which is true. All I know is that his mother's voice carried the same rhythm every time she repeated the phrase, "receiving treatment," like the words were a rope she kept pulling even though nothing moved on the other end. I also know what happens when a record is sealed. The sealing doesn't erase the event. It just separates the event from the people who lived inside it. The story continues, but not in public. It continues in cabinets, in files, in compartments that trade names the way units trade patches. It continues as policy, as protocol, as a practiced response to a practiced problem. On the night we saw the craft, the most important thing wasn't the object in the sky. It was the speed with which a different object arrived, the mechanism that took our evidence, replaced our language, and removed one of us. That mechanism did not feel improvised. It felt older than us. It felt like something built to survive individual careers, individual administrations, individual wars. A system that doesn't need belief. It needs compliance. I used to think the worst thing about that night was not knowing what the craft was. I don't think that anymore. The craft is a question that can stay unanswered. Questions are tolerable. What I can't tolerate is the fact that the system had a use for our fear and a place to store it. It stored it in our signatures. It stored it in our transfers. It stored it in Hargrove. I've learned that classification isn't just a stamp on paper. It's a way of changing what is possible. When something is classified high enough, it becomes unreachable not only to the public, but to the normal parts of your own life. You can't talk about it without losing your job. You can't prove it without breaking laws. You can't even grieve it properly because acknowledging it publicly would require admitting it exists. So you hold it in private, and private holding becomes private damage. That's what I'm leaving behind in this recording. Not a revelation, not a demand, a record of private damage. If someone someday opens a file and sees my name attached to a night patrol, they will see a sanitized report and nothing else. They will see atmospheric phenomenon. They will see signatures that look voluntary. They will not see the captain with no name tape. They will not see Hargrove's face in the rearview mirror. They will not see the way the craft stopped in mid-air, like inertia was a suggestion. Maybe that is the point. Maybe the system doesn't need to erase the event. It only needs to erase the parts that make it human. I don't know what I expected when I started writing. I thought putting words down might make the weight lighter. It hasn't. If anything, it has made the edges sharper. But there is one small change. The event feels less like a dream now. Dreams dissolve when you wake. This doesn't. When I close my eyes, I can still see the triangle cutting stars out of the sky. The lights steady and wrong. The center pulse like a slow heartbeat. I can still feel the moment it faced us, the way my body recognized attention before my mind admitted it. I can still hear the command voice on the radio. Return to base immediately. Do not investigate. And I can still hear myself saying to Hargrove, follow instructions, as if instructions could protect him. That sentence is the part that doesn't fade. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary. It was the ordinary language of compliance that turns a person into paperwork. If there is a lesson in this, it's not a lesson I can package. It's just a realization that comes quiet and stays. Some things don't end when the lights go out and the report gets signed. They end when the last person who remembers them stops speaking. I'm speaking now because I don't want the record to finish its work. And because somewhere, in whatever facility holds my teammate, I want it to be true that at least one of us did not let his name vanish completely. That is all. The rest is silence, doing what it was designed to do.